Hello everyone and welcome back. Today we're gonna review a session I played at No Limit 100 on GG, but we're gonna do it a bit differently. What do I mean? Instead of looking at the whole thing, we're only gonna look at a few specific spots that I picked, and more so we're gonna look into the underlying concepts and exploits, which might be things that are not part of your game yet. So if you wanna do your win rate a favor, and if you wanna learn some new interesting things, then stick around and yeah, let's do this. Okay, the first concept I wanna talk about is to 4-bet aggressively. What do I mean by that? I will replay the hand at the bottom right and explain. We open from cutoff with pocket sevens, get 3-bet from the button, and I'm gonna stop here real quick. I think it's very common and intuitive to just snap call here and not even think about alternative options. At least it's what I'm seeing a lot in game. And what I would suggest is to widen your perspective a bit and to keep the option of 4-betting in mind as well. I will replay the rest of the hand and then I will explain. So what I did here is prepare a chart which is a GTO wizard output with no limit 500 rake. Very standard output, nothing specific about it. And if we look at this, I think we see that there's a lot of 4-betting going on. Some of you might be a bit surprised. If we look at combos like ace queen offsuit, that's definitely something I think people always find, or at least mostly. Then there are some suited, pretty obvious ones like ace 5 suited, ace 4 suited. But I think what gets overlooked a bit is that there's also a low frequency for 7s, 8s, 9s, 10s. And what's important to understand here is that just because the solver chooses one action mostly doesn't mean that the other action is a mistake. Both actions are viable. That's the takeaway that we should get from this. And what I want to do now is change your mind and show you a few data points why mostly 4-betting these hands might actually be better. What you see now on the right side is the same spot. So we open cutoff, button 3-bets, and this is our reaction. The only thing I changed is the rake. So instead of using no limit 500 rake, I use no limit 50 rake. And what is pretty obvious, I think, at first sight is that we start to fold more. And at the same time, we also start to 4-bet more. Why is this happening? Both actions, folding and 4-betting, lead to seeing less flops. So why does the solver not want to see the flop here at NL50? It's a very simple reason. It's because the rake is too high. So every time we see the flop, we have this disadvantage. This is obviously especially true against other regulars, because if both people are decent players, then it's hard that one of them has a massive edge on the other one. So what happens when you see the flop is that both players immediately get a big disadvantage because they pay rake. And a way to avoid it is obviously to fold, but we don't want to fold everything. We can't let our opponent auto profit with his 3-bets. So what's the next thing we can do, especially at lower stakes? And I assume mostly players from lower stakes will be watching this. So what we can do is 4-bet more aggressively. And what you can see here is that the 4-bet frequency of 8s, 9s and 10s is increasing by quite a bit. Pocket 7s not necessarily, but I think in actuality there's not a huge difference. So this whole rake concept is already a very big argument that should hopefully change your mind. If it doesn't, then I want to add some more things, because in this hand specifically I was playing on GG, so pots get raked pre-flop already. So this concept in my case here didn't even apply. But I think there's other benefits to 4-betting a lot, which is first of all that we avoid the 3-bet pot out of position preflop caller line, which is very annoying and hard to play. Probably one of the hardest spots in the entire game. So we avoid that line, and at the same time we put our opponent in a very uncomfortable line, which is to be the pre-flop caller in a 4-bet pot, and we have kind of a green light post-flop to play very aggressively. Especially these low pocket pairs will often get turned into a bluff and maybe play for stacks and put our opponent to the test and make his life miserable. And another thing to mention is that we also have a very easy decision versus 5-bet. So if we 4-bet these lower pocket pairs and our opponent shoves, we can easily fold and not worry about anything, basically. The next advice I want to give you guys is to always think ahead and ask yourself, where does my EV come from? I am talking about the hand at the bottom right, where we have pocket aces. Our opponent opens the small blind and we will obviously 3-bet him. On the flop we can keep it simple and bet at a super high frequency. This hand definitely has to bet. On the turn though is where it gets interesting. So the turn card is pretty dynamic, and at the same time ranges are very wide because we're playing in a 3-bet pot blind versus blind. So we have to make a decision here. Should we c-bet our hand or should we check it back? And this is where thinking ahead comes into play. An important data point in this hand is that I had a read that my opponent is very, very aggressive. So whenever you can either enter into a value betting line or enter in a line where your EV at least partly comes from getting bluffed by your opponent, you should decide usually based on your opponent. So in this case, knowing that my opponent has very aggressive tendencies, I know that in the check back line I can expect a lot of bluffs, and this increases the EV of the check back line. The other option would be to c-bet, which if you look this up in a solver, it will c-bet this combo at a very, very high frequency. So there definitely is the option of extracting value. It's just a matter of in which line is our EV gonna be higher. The big problem I see here in the c-betting line is that if we get check raised on, we're in a huge amount of trouble, because in solver land against a check shove on the turn, this hand is an easy call. I have a pretty strong opinion that in game, if we face a check shove here, we're not in an amazing spot. It might still be a call, but it probably still is a call, but it is at best a slightly winning one. Maybe it is a break-even one, maybe it is even losing, depends on how he constructs his range on the turn. But in GTO land, he's definitely supposed to have some lighter shoves here. He will even shove worse value hands than ours. I think a hand like Jack 9 suited can probably shove. So that's why in GTO land folding is out of question. In game, I would say we just can't know for sure what our opponent will do here. But if we compare this kind of situation of uncertainty with option B of just checking back and knowing with almost certainty that our opponent will overbluff rivers, because BVB again, ranges are very wide, he has a lot of potential bluffing combos on the river, and I can call this hand pretty much on every river. because even if the river is super dynamic and straights complete or flushes complete, it will be very intuitive for my opponent to turn a lot of low pair type hands into bluffs, and he might go into overbluffing territory pretty soon. So basically I have these two options, and by looking ahead I avoid the spot that can potentially be close to 0 EV and choose on the other hand the spot where I know that it will be very high EV based on the aggressive nature of my opponent. I will play out the rest of the hand. So I decide to check back the turn. And on the river we face a pretty fast 75% bet. This might look scary at first, the bluff catching would definitely perform better on brick rivers, but I am very confident that even on these very dynamic rivers we can bluff catch successfully. So we go for the call. And our opponent shows us Ace-8 suited, which is a hand that would have folded turn, and we gave him the opportunity to bluff it river. And yeah, that was the whole point of the play, and obviously nice to see it working out. The next piece of advice is to not be too obsessed with GTO outputs. I will replay the hand first and then I will explain. I'm talking about the hand at the top left. We call Queen 9 off in the big blind. It's a single raised pot. Our opponent checks back the flop, and at this point we have a pretty intuitive bluffing hand. Not much else we can do, I would say here, with even having the flush blocker. So we go for it. Then on the river we hit a pair, but we still decide to bluff and do so for an overbet sizing. And our opponent decides to fold. So why did I say do not obsess with the GTO outputs? If we look at this spot in Pile Solver, so in position checks back, turn is the 6 of diamonds, our hand gets a mostly bet. We do so and our opponent calls, then we get the 9 of hearts river. If you look at this, and I had a feeling in game as well, that this combo from a GTO point of view is too strong to bluff. So basically by hitting the 9 on the river, we hit a bunch of showdown value, and now we have a decent amount of EV in the check-check line. So why did I decide to overbet bluff anyway? There are two main reasons for it. First of all, if we overbet here, I am pretty sure that my opponent will overfold. If we look at his reaction to the overbet, there are quite some combos that need to hero call. We have pretty much every combo king queen off, similar king jack off, not only the ones with a flush blocker but also the other ones. Reason for it is that even though we are not blocking a flush, we're still blocking the straight, which is kind of relevant. Same applies to these combos here, queen 10 off, jack 10 off, and these offsuit hands make up for a lot of combos. So if we can assume that our opponent will not find these hero calls, our bluff should overperform and our EV should go up. If I go one step back here and look at the EV of queen 9 off, let's look at our specific combo, queen of spades, 9 of diamonds. As you can see, the EV of overbet and EV of check are super close, they're basically the same. So why is it not overbetting in Pio land? It's a matter of balance. It doesn't want to reach an overbluffing frequency. It only has a certain amount of value and therefore it can balance it only with a certain amount of bluffs. Should we care about this in game? No, absolutely not. Our opponent will never know unless he has some specific read on us. So in general, overbluffing is rarely a bad idea. And the second reason for me finding the bet here is that the alternative of checking can get me again into a 0 EV spot. So let's say we check. If our opponent checks back and we win, that's obviously fine. But let's say he fires a bet on the river. What happens to our combo? It's indifferent. So we should sometimes call it, sometimes fold it. This is the case in Pioland, but in game there is for sure an option which is better. So against some opponents it might be better to call it, against other opponents it might be better to fold it. The problem is if we don't know. So if I'm playing against an unknown player in the pool, why should I put myself into this spot of uncertainty instead of just going one step back and taking the easy route, which is taking a combo that can equally well just go for a bluff and benefit from the fact that pretty much every player in the pool is overfolding to these kind of lines, and be happy. The next concept is a very important one, which is to make big folds in heavily underbluffed spots. I am talking about the hand at the top right, where we have ace king off in the big blind. So obviously we start off with a 3-bet and our opponent calls. Flop, we have a very easy c-bet. The same thing applies on the turn with the 2 overcards, the gut shot and the flush blocker. On the river is where it gets a bit trickier. We hit top pair, but I think it's very likely that to a lot of you guys this already feels like a dicey spot. Definitely not a slam dunk value bet. So what do we do here? The best option is actually to check fold. I will replay the rest of the hand. So why can I check fold here and not have endless nightmares afterwards? I will show you in PioSolver. So we c-bet the flop, get called, get the 3 of hearts turn. As we can see, our combo is always a c-bet on the turn as well. So we bet and get called, and the river is the king of diamonds. So as you can see, even Pio treats this spot as too thin for value betting. There's a slight bit of value betting going on, mainly based on some suit magic, which in actuality doesn't matter much, I think. So what Pio is doing here is, once it has the ace of hearts, it recognizes that there is a lower chance of getting bluffed because we reduce our opponent's combos of missed flush draws. So that's why with the specific combo we had in game, it decides to shove ourselves. I think this is very problematic against real opponents, because what has to happen here are some very light calls. As we can see, ace queen off, ace queen suited, some ace 10 suited, and I think we can all agree that this is not happening in game. Our immediate exploitative thought should be, okay, so we can bluff this spot very heavily, but that's not the concept of this hand. So let's go one step back and say, okay, this is too thin to value bet, so our only option is to check. Now what happens? Our opponent in the hand jammed, and this is our response in Pioland. Ace king off is already close to being indifferent. It depends heavily on the combo, but overall it prefers the call. So why did I get to the conclusion in game that this is actually an easy fold? I will show you guys real quick. So if we check here, this is what our opponent has to do on the river. Basically he has to do a couple of things. First of all, he has to value bet very thin. He has to shove ace king himself at a pretty high frequency, and so in Pioland we are splitting with these combos. and at the same time he takes a lot of showdown value hands and turns them into a bluff. What I'm talking about here is a combo like ace-10 suited, or even 9s, 8s and 7s. I think we can agree that most players don't even get to the river with these combos. And I think we can also agree that most players don't realize that at this point they have to take a hand like ace-10 suited and turn them into a bluff. So let's make a very simple node log and say, okay, my opponent is never bluffing ace-10 suited here. That's all we're gonna do. Just those few combos, not gonna make drastic changes, so we're gonna rerun it from here and see what happens. Now we check, our opponent checks back, ace-10 suited, very likely to happen in-game in my opinion. What is our reaction? We only call the nuts basically. Ace-king now is a super clear fold, it would now be a massive punt to call it. And that's why in-game we should realize that in such a tight range spot it will be very hard for our opponent to find enough bluffs, and that we can easily fold a bluff catcher like ace-king and move on with our lives. Last but not least, we have a very wild one, which is the hand at the top left, and the underlying concept that I want to teach you here is to not give your opponent too much credit for balancing their sizes. So we open from the small blind. Obviously this is a very loose open, in GTO land this would always be a fold. I had a read that my opponent was not 3-betting enough, which drastically increases the EV of my opens. Maybe I went a little bit too far, but I actually think it's fine. We see this flop, which is terrible for the out of position player here, so we will check at a super high frequency. And our opponent decides to check back. Now on this turn we have again a pretty intuitive check, I would say. Hard to get paid from behind and hard to fold out better as well. Now opponent goes for the small step. BVB ranges are very wide, so we cannot fold versus this small bet with a decent pair that unblocks most of his bluffs. So we decide to call. And now on the river is where things get really spicy. Our opponent decides to bet 75% pot. We go for a pretty big check raise, and luckily we get a fold. So at first glance I might look a bit like a maniac here, but bear with me, I will explain in a second. Once again we can have a look in PioSolver to get a better picture. So on the flop both players check. The turn is the ace of spades. Our opponent steps small, which is a solver approved size here. Our specific hand is obviously not part of this range, as we can see here, but we can look at king 4 suited, which will pretty much be the same thing, and the hand calls at full frequency, so we call, and the river is a queen of diamonds. Now we check, our opponent bets 75 and we decide to check raise him. If we look at king 4 suited here, this is never happening, the hand mostly folds, it sometimes calls at very low frequency. So you might ask, why did I decide to go for the check raise? If we look at the combos that are bluff check raising in Pioland, it is actually mostly the straight combos. And not only the straight combos, it's actually the straight plus pair combos. We have a hand here like queen 5 suited, or ace 5 suited, or 5-4 suited. So what's the reason for this? In this spot it's all about unblockers, because we can never block a flush. If we block a flush here, we have a flush. So if we would only bluff if we were blocking a flush, it would be completely pointless and we would have literally no bluffs. So we have to be a bit more creative. And why did I say unblockers? Well, all of these combos that are bluff check raising here, being a straight and having a pair at the same time, they have no card that could block the opponent's bluffing range. So basically they do a wonderful job at keeping all the bluffing combos in the opponent's range. So what about the combo that I chose in-game? King 4 suited. Is the situation this much different? I would say no. Having the 4 we also unblock bluffs, and having the king probably we do as well. He might bluff some king x in reality, who knows, but I think it's still a card that does a pretty good job at unblocking. So in terms of GTO, there's not much difference here. You will never see Pio go for this play because it's balanced. It cannot overbluff or it will get punished. But guess what? In game we can. And the decisive point of this hand is not about GTO, it's not about blockers. It's about the fact that very likely our opponent will not be balanced. What do I mean here? Let's have a look at his betting range at the river that bets 75. We can check this here in the Range Explorer. So after filtering for only the part that we are worried about, which are his straight flushes and flushes, we can see that there is some mixing going on. Some of them are betting overbet, some of these combos are betting 75. It obviously heavily depends on the combo, and what you will see happening is the better the flush, the more it will use overbet, the worse the flush, the more it will bet 75. I think that makes a lot of sense. But Pio is always balanced, so if we look at a hand here like King Queen with the King of Spades, it will sometimes overbet, sometimes 75. Same here for King Jack, it will use both sizes. So what's basically happening here is that Pio protects its 75% range by not only including weak flushes, but also some nut flushes and also some straight flushes. Do we think opponents in-game will do that? Do we think they are worried about getting bluffed, they are worried about being balanced, or will they just be greedy and whenever they have a straight flush or a king high flush, they will just overbet and they will 75 everything else? I'm not even gonna answer this, I think it's extremely obvious, and so that's the reason why I went for this very funky play, because I'm just very confident that in this specific sizing progression that my opponent used, which was 1/3 turn into 75 river, he will just never have, or almost never have, a hand that is stronger than a queen high flush. And my play on the other hand will look very strong. And so I'm pretty confident that the average opponent here will find some pretty big folds with his queen high, jack high flushs. And the play has a lot of potential to outperform. And again, kinda coming back to the topic we already had before, don't obsess with Pio outputs, think about the range of your opponent, think about how much you can actually make him fold, and if you think the play is gonna print, then just go for it. Okay guys, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed the content, maybe you learned a thing or two, maybe there's something you can integrate in your game, and yeah, I will see you soon again. For now, have a good day and good luck at the tables.